for the next speaker will be Phil Rubinstein, who will be representing the International Schiller Institute Forum for a New Paradigm. This forum was set up about a year and a half ago, or a little bit more, in order to bring together leading scientists, policymakers, and leading citizens from around the world in a series of conferences, which was originally initiated by Helga Zeppler-Roush, the chairwoman of the Buzo Party in Germany. And this forum is dedicated to bringing about a paradigm, as we got a taste of, that's founded upon the ideals of human beings made as the Constitution of the United States has proclaimed, in the image of a creator with inalienable rights that must be the basis not only of political decisions but also economic decisions, and not this belief in a hedonistic man made in the image of monkeys and dogs who are fighting for their own survival and pleasure before they die, which is the foundation of the current transatlantic monetary ideology, which has spread itself a little too far and wide for its own good. So Phil Rubinstein has been also a spokesperson for Roush's organization for 4 decades or longer. And we're about to hear a few ideas that he's about to introduce on a panel or in a speech called Towards a True Science of Physical Economy. So Phil, you're on.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. So in some ways, to pick the strand up from Paul and from Matt's introduction, just to take it a little step further back, the Schiller Institute was founded in 1984 by the initiation of Helga Roush. Now, I suppose one interesting way to look at the whole thing and the connection, the beginning of a connection that I'll try to outline, is that Helga herself, on August 25th and 26th, a little bit earlier this week, was at a forum in China, which is, to my knowledge, she's probably had about 4 or 5 significant trips to China in the last couple of decades. She had originally gone there as a journalist student in the early 1970s. But in terms of the political work in conjunction with as the chairperson of the Schiller Institute and collaborating with Lin as the leading international spokesman for this development, she's been there recently in the late 1990s and increasingly over the last year. And so she was at a conference at Langzhou University in Gansu province in China. The topic of that discussion, that overall 2-day conference, was the role of cultural development that will be played by the Silk Road. And Helga herself is known as the Silk Road Lady. And of course, in the last year, and really most sharply May of this year, Xi Jinping, the president of China, has announced that the Silk Road, based on the ancient pathway of the ancient Silk Road, is the policy, but obviously an updated policy of China. And that policy is a policy of the development of corridors, nuclear development, the electrification of all of China and Asia, and so on and so forth. So Helga is known as the Silk Road Lady, and obviously also as their chairperson of the Schiller Institute. The relevance is that the Schiller Institute, as indicated by what Matt said, was founded as a cultural institution, as an institution to recognize that scientific development, the kind of insight, the creativity of discovery in the scientific realm, that is, in terms of human knowledge and control of the forces of nature, for the purposes of discovering more about nature through the development of the powers of mankind itself, including, most especially, the intellectual powers, the creativity, the ideas. And that freedom is the freedom to develop those powers and those ideas which turn out to be necessary in human development. To make it crystal clear, the kind of creativity that you experience in great classical composition, whether it's in music, in the classics of Mozart, Beethoven, and others, or in the realm of drama, Shakespeare, Schiller himself, Aeschylus, or in the realm of the plastic arts, the fact of the matter is it's the same quality of creativity that gives us true genius in these realms, in the artistic compositional realms, and in science. That it's all one piece. It's one totality. And of course, while that can be said relatively simply, in present-day culture, that idea is not so clear. For example, the notion that artistic creativity is different. It's a matter of taste. It's a matter of what you like. No one would think of saying that about scientific discovery. There may be versions of, well, there's a matter of elegance and simplicity, but in the end, you wouldn't consider it a scientific discovery unless it gave us greater power over some of the facets of nature. Whereas the idea is that classical composition, classical art, is somehow, in the end, there is no truth in it, except a truth about the taste or the pleasures of certain people or certain groups of people. Now, that is not the conception of creativity that actually functions in human history. In human history, when we've progressed scientifically in terms of fundamental principles, the people involved in that, and usually the entirety of the culture, has also been a culture that created great compositional capabilities that really are an expression, and in some ways a more direct expression, of the methods that create scientific discoveries than any other mechanical or formulaic or deductive mathematical method. Truth is really not a matter of analytic certainty, mathematical deduction. Truth is expressed in an accurate conception of the powers and development of the universe we live in. So that truth is never something approximated. It's something that is creatively discovered and is never a thing in itself. It's always a discovery about a further potential for development. Therefore, value is the development of human creative powers and the ability to expand those powers through the use of existing scientific and technological knowledge, opening up new vast areas like the microscopic world or the astrophysical world or the submicroscopical world. Now, in 1984, when Helge proposed such an institution, which was meant to be an institution that would overcome and bring together the exponents of the Cold War, the United States, Russia, the Third World, and so forth. And you can say the founding statement of the Schiller Institute was a version of the Declaration of Independence of the United States, of the American Revolution. Helge changed a few words to make it appropriate to an international document applying to several nations that might adopt it. That is, it could be applied under any conditions. It was a statement of liberation for the global population. Now, that is the institution, and that's still the basic conception. I think the other element that's even more relevant today was that Friedrich Schiller was the center of a group of people that formed the Weimar Classic period in Germany at the end of the 18th and the early 19th century. And this was probably the last great Renaissance, a high point of cultural development, which saw its roots in the American Revolution, most especially. And Schiller, as the poet of freedom, known as such in the United States, celebrated throughout the 19th century, and probably in Canada in some ways also. But Schiller was a political activist at working with the Humboldt brothers, Lessing, and others. And he was, like many Europeans of the time, were looking to see the spread of the American Revolution to the European continent, which in many ways was the mission of the United States when the Pilgrims came here in the early 17th century, to break from the oligarchy of Europe and to bring the potential for a true republic to the New World, and then bring it back, hopefully, to the Old World. Well, when the French Revolution occurred, at the beginning, at the build-up to it, a number of people thought, well, this was the beginning of a European revolution like the American Revolution. However, that revolution was ultimately taken over by agents of the British Empire, an empire evolving at that moment. And France was destroyed by a Jacobin upheaval of nihilistic, anti-human outlook. And what Schiller's comment is forever famous on this: a great historic moment has come upon a small people. That the people of Europe, and the French in particular, were not up to the level and didn't have the leadership to grab the intensity and the potentials of that moment in history. Now, of course, today, we're faced with a great moment in history. We're faced with something Roosevelt is famous for his comment, his speech at the beginning of World War II, or the early phase of World War II, when he said, this generation has a destiny with fate, a destiny with history. It's destined to play a historic role. Now, I would say in this period, on an even larger scale, and with the potentials for an even greater potential for a renaissance, a revolutionary outcome, is before us. We have probably the greatest constellation of nations oriented to human scientific progress ever put together. China, India, Russia, a good chunk of South America, South Africa, Egypt. Egypt has now turned to an entirely different approach. In a sense, going back to the legacy of Nasser and some of the other leaders of the non-aligned movement breaking from colonialism. But al-Sisi, the new president, has now called for a one-year mobilization to build the second Suez Canal. And the Egyptians have already put out a call for all male, able-bodied males under the age of 45 to apply for jobs for that project. And there are other projects. Egypt has played a role in the ceasefire in the Middle East. China is playing a role in the potential development of Africa. You see a tendency toward a cooperation amongst nation states. Now, why has that come now? Because, as Paul outlined, the transatlantic system is dead. The banking system is bankrupt. Most of the countries, the United States, France, Italy, Spain, even Germany, Great Britain, bankrupt. The amount of financial value that exists is orders of magnitude greater than the production and the rate of productivity in those cultures. In effect, There's nothing behind the US dollar. The US doesn't produce anything anymore. Less than 10% of the country is involved in manufacturing. We've taken down the NASA program. We don't build infrastructure anymore. And so on. The healthcare system is dying or killing people. Maybe that's a better way to understand it. We don't produce, we're not a productive nation. Most of Europe has given up productivity. The production in the world is in China, increasingly in India, even in Russia. But the Chinese are probably, they've taken upon themselves the task of lifting 1.4 billion people to a new level of living standard, of potential future. And the future is what the human species is all about. Now, to bring that to the question of physical economy, which is in the area of the greatest relevant discovery that Lyndon LaRouche has made. Because the essence of human economy is the reproduction of human society. In other words, human beings don't really simply reproduce biologically. That's an element of it. But animals don't reproduce their environment. They reproduce themselves biologically. They live, but they're essentially non-cognitive. That's the difference. It's not whether animals suffer pain or etc. The issue is, are they capable of creative discovery? How do they reproduce themselves? Human beings don't simply reproduce themselves. They reproduce society's ability to reproduce as a whole. So to be productive is to add to the capabilities of society, to reproduce the entirety of society, but that's not enough. Because if we simply reproduce the existing capabilities, the existing knowledge, the existing portion of society that has the ability to be creative and therefore increase the productivity of labor, we run into a problem, which is manifested in the system, but really way before, because the system goes speculative. It goes completely financial, where the only issue is you bet on the value of a financial instrument, and you try to find the means to make that bet good. That's called speculative capitalism, where there's no value in the product. The value is in what you're willing to pay for an instrument that is really not even based on that product. It's based on a bet about how much you're willing to pay for the financial paper that supposedly commands the commodity or the service or whatever. And therefore, you can have a complete disconnect, so that the system is run by money that has no connection to the ability to reproduce. For example, in the United States, we can no longer reproduce our population at a level required to maintain the standard of living or even the life. It's a downward spiral. There's no such thing as a subsistence level. Now, the manifestation of it is that the resource base of any given technology becomes ever more expensive. It becomes harder and harder, like fracking. You have to expend more and more to get less and less. It's already begun with, offshore drilling and so on and so forth. Now, the only way you can deal with it is to define a new scientific discovery which gives us an entirely new resource base. Thus, value resides in that kind of creative scientific progress of human labor, of human reproductive capabilities. And this means going into ever more, ever expanded regions of the universe itself. That's what makes us human. We're not different than animals. We're absolutely different than animals. We have a different means of existence, or what, philosophically you could call it, we have a different ontological basis. But that's what it means. Now, LaRouche has been the exponent of a redefinition or a definition of physical economy in these terms. Effectively, this was the outlook of Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, and indeed they created financial and economic systems that were based on this outlook. If you look at the Report on Manufactures by Hamilton, or if you look at Lincoln and the greenback policy of the Civil War, the rail policy, this became the spark for development in Europe, in Germany, in France and Russia, later Japan and China during the last third of the 19th century. This was the reason that the British started World War I. And this is what we face today. Put in the simplest terms, since 1971, in the crash of the Bretton Woods system that LaRouche forecast, we've existed under an increasingly speculative monetarist system, up to the present point where we have a almost completely deregulated, speculative financial system that has no productive value in it. We have 2 quadrillion. That's 2 followed by 15 zeros. Or in other words, it's 1,000 trillion or 1 billion billion in derivatives. There is nothing in the economy to back that value up. The way they intend to do it is to actually squeeze it out of the blood and bones of a global population, to reduce it, perhaps to less than 1 billion people. That's been stated by the consort of the Queen of England itself, and so forth. Value in the present system is found in reducing the level of humanity. In a human system, you really do find that you need more people. And you need to leap at this point to do what we need to do in China or in India. Whereas maybe 20 years ago, we could have done it in a more continual basis, moving through nuclear fission and so on and so forth. Now we need a leap forward into a fusion-driven economy and the science associated with fusion power, with a helium-based fusion reaction, which is what the Chinese are oriented to. It's what their moon project is all about. At this point, the great seat of a future for humanity, of a driving force politically and culturally, of a sort of economic miracle, resides in what China is attempting to do. Probably the greatest problem we face is the obstacles put in the way of that progress and the spread of that idea, as Paul described it, coming from a dying transatlantic system. Now, LaRouche has been the leading figure since the late 1960s, whose forecasts, whose scientific outlook, and whose political organizing has been to accurately understand where humanity is headed, what the nature of the crisis is, and the shift to a different conception of mankind, one that does have roots in our civilization as in others. The Renaissance of the 15th century, the Christian response to the Roman Empire, the Greek Renaissance, and of course the Renaissances of other developments on the planet. But LaRouche has been the leading figure of advancing this idea to its most developed standpoint today. And we're at the point where we do have a choice. It's not, we have a very significant choice to have a great historic moment find us, particularly in the West, particularly in the United States and North America and Canada, breaking with the British Empire, to find ourselves at least a big enough people to join in that project. So I think I will leave it at that. I think it's in the time allotted.